So I'm going to be talking to you about interventionism and regulations. As with all these things, this is a huge area, and if they had asked any of the speakers to pick this, they might have all picked different topics to focus on. I tried to avoid dealing with things that I looked at the schedule to see what are you guys going to get like whole lectures on later in the week. So I tried to avoid things like healthcare and stuff like that, and minimum wage legislation. So some of those things I'll just allude to, but I'll try to focus on stuff that you're not going to get elsewhere during this week. Okay, so first of all, let me make sure you know what we mean by this term. So on the one hand, you can have like a sort of pure market economy, the ideal of capitalism, Ayn Rand, okay. On a different extreme, you can imagine what could be called a command economy or socialism, Karl Marx, right? And by the way, I wasn't trying to do a left-right thing because you might have thought it would be the opposite, but I don't like the left-right paradigm, so I did that on purpose. And then in the middle, you can have sort of a mixed economy, what might be called interventionism. All right, if you don't know, that's Paul Krugman. And once he was sipping champagne and somebody got a picture of it, so now that's great. Anytime you want to rail against, limousine liberals, you've got that up on the Google image search. So in this scheme, so again, I just picked term. You can see how the pattern here, that there's something economy, or people call it something that ends with ism. All right, and so these are labels that people will use. So there's no hard and fast rule. In the next slide, I'll give you an example of an economist who did try to give a hard and fast dividing line. But the idea is, in the context of public policy discussions and how political writers talk about this stuff, often you will hear people say things like the following: oh yes, the market economy is great, it harnesses greed, and it really has a lot of innovation and produces new products and things like that. But geez, there's all these excesses. There's just the rich are so rich, and there's people starving in the streets while these other people live in mansions, and some people can't get health insurance, and it destroys the environment, or it's not great for the environment in certain situations. There's all these things about just pure unregulated capitalism that kind of offends our moral sensibilities. On the other hand, socialism sounds great in theory, but in practice, look at all the awful things, and man, it seems like it's not a great economic system. And so, instead of being ideological and either saying we need to have pure market economy capitalism like these people like Ayn Rand or something would say, or saying outright let's have the workers take control of the means of production like Marx would say, why don't we be practical and realistic and have something, try to get the best of both worlds and have a mixed economy, or what we might call interventionism, where there's a basic framework of a market economy. There's still private property, stuff like that, but it's regulated by the government to try to fix the things we don't like about it. Okay, so that's the way somebody who endorsed this approach would justify it. And in that respect, it sounds kind of reasonable. It sounds like, yeah, why would you just be real ideological and a purist? Why not just look at what works and take the best of capitalism and temper it with our moral sensibilities and so on? All right, so that's the appeal of the so-called mixed economy or interventionism. Just so you know, there are a lot of writers in the classical liberal tradition who think that's a mirage, or something to be watched out for, a seductive thing that will destroy your country or your economy, because they're saying the logic of interventionism is that you can't just do a piecemeal thing and tinker with the market and fix something you don't like and then move on and say, okay, we fix that's going to lead to unintended consequences that then will make the public say, oh, we don't like this new thing, and then the government comes in and regulates that, and it just boom, boom, you keep doing whack-a-mole so you have to kind of decide, do we want to have full-blown socialism, or do we want to have a pretty much pure market economy that it's not stable to try to just tinker with it. So in any event, that's the schema here, and so what I'm going to be talking about in this lecture is just giving you lots of different examples of unintended consequences, things where the government's going to come in and tinker with the market economy, trying to fix something that the public finds undesirable about the market outcome, and then show you how that leads to things that most people would say, ooh, we don't like that either. And then you kind of have to decide, do you back off that first intervention, or do you just keep doing more and more interventions? Okay, so as I mentioned, so you might say there's like a spectrum from like pure laissez-faire market capitalism on the one hand to pure government owns everything, all the means of production, and tells everybody where to go to work on the other hand. And in practice, there's no historical example that we can point to, like if you're a defender of the market economy, to say, yep, the U.S. in this time period or Great Britain in this time period, that's exactly what we mean when we talk about laissez-faire capitalism, right? That if you go back in time, certainly the U.S. federal government was smaller, didn't tax as much and so on, but you go back far enough and there was outright slavery. So clearly that's not what we have in mind if we're defending the classical market economy. So there's always those problems. So you might wonder, okay, so in practice, like even theoretically, is there a sharp dividing line? The economist Murray Rothbard one time asked Ludwig von Mises this question, and he said, is there just shades of gray, or is there a sharp line that you would draw between the market economy that may be heavily regulated, but nonetheless you're going to say that's capitalism versus outright socialism? And he actually thought Mises was going to say, nah, there's not really, but Mises gave him a sharp answer. He said that, that if there's a stock market, then I'm going to call that a market economy. It may be heavily regulated and not perform very well because of interventionism, but to me that's not socialism. He says that it can't be socialism if the authorities allow private individuals to own pieces of the giant corporations that own all the factories and the farmland and stuff like that. That Mises was saying that's just a farce if they're going to call that socialism if they allow private ownership of the corporations that own all the means of production. That's not socialism. Okay, so for what it's worth, that was if you're wondering, I'm not wed to this criterion, but I just wanted to mention that to you. Okay, so before. Later in the lecture, I'm going to get into stuff that you're going to think of as more of like economic analysis, but let me, it's the morning. I don't know, some of you may not have had coffee yet, in which case that was a very foolish thing for you to do. You chose poorly. But let me try to give you some ones that are more, fun examples, things that you may not have heard before that you wouldn't normally think of as what you're going to get from an economist. Okay, so one is endangered species regulations. Spotted owl, so the way the conventional arguments worked, this may be a little bit before your guys' time, but when I was in high school and stuff, there was these big arguments about Western land usage, and so if somebody saw a spotted owl on their property, they couldn't develop their land, right? And so there was this big arguments between people who were like pro-development and logging and stuff like this. Oh, we want jobs and whatever, good for the economy, and how can we do that? The government's coming in, the federal government's regulating, this is crazy. And you can imagine like Rush Limbaugh and stuff, which side they would come down on that dispute. And then there were, pro-environmental people and saying, oh no, we need to promote diversity, and there could be cures for cancer or something in the rainforest, and we got to be real careful about that stuff. So that was the way the trade-off was depicted. But then some economists came in and said, wait a minute, we need to worry about unintended consequences. It's not this simple, are we for development and economic growth on the one hand versus protecting the spotted owl. They said these regulations could have a perverse unintended consequences, and what they called it was the 3 S's, all right? And what that stood for was shoot, shovel, and shut up, okay? And what that meant was they were saying there was this pattern that they started observing, or this phenomenon where, let me just motivate it by a made-up story. So you're some landowner out in the Midwest, and you were getting ready to clear you had forest, and you're getting ready to clear that out, and the guys were going to come and cut down the trees, get rid of the branches and the trunks and so forth, and then clear it and put a big shopping mall there, right? And you were signing the deal, and you were going to make millions of dollars off of this, selling your land to do that. You're pretty happy. You're out on your backyard sipping coffee, and you look and you see, oh my gosh, there's a spotted owl on my tree, right? The week before, all the construction crews are going to come in and clear this thing. And if anybody from the federal government found out about that, this would now become protected habitat, and I couldn't touch this land, and I would have to leave it like this, and I would lose out on my millions of dollars. So when you see that spotted owl, are you going to get on the phone and call Al Gore and say, guess what I just saw in my backyard? And they're saying, no, you may perversely have the incentive to look around and get your gun and shoot that thing and bury it and never mention this to anybody else ever again, okay? And so because again, strictly speaking, the regulation is not saying if there's a spotted owl on your property, you can't develop it. It's saying if the authorities find out that there's a spotted owl on your property, we can't develop it. If they never find out, how are they going to know? And so it was actually, and then more practically beyond, like the example of me just saying you see a spotted owl, that people would try to change the habitat, their land, such that it would not be appealing to a particular endangered species, right? So if they knew spotted owls or some kind of slug or whatever that was protected liked things of a certain kind, certain kinds of trees or whatever, you would try to make it so that your property was not at all appealing to them, because you did not want them coming on your property, because if they did, you were dead in the water and you couldn't develop it, and then it would lose a lot of its economic value. So the point was, it was not clear that these regulations, even though they were certainly interfering with conventionally defined property rights, it wasn't even clear that they were helping the endangered species. In some cases maybe they were, but the point was, you couldn't just assume that because the government passed some regulations saying let's protect the spotted owl by saying if we catch anybody who makes their habitats or interferes with their habitats, then we know that there's spotted owls there. You get in trouble for doing that. It's not obvious you're actually helping the spotted owls. Okay, so that's just one example. Another one, seatbelt laws. Okay, so here, you may not know this, but because I think at this point it's pretty much universal across the states, but there was a period where it was not, you could drive around without a seatbelt, and that wasn't against the law. And then there was a wave of, I think it was from pressure from the federal government, but state by state, because they were getting highway funding or something, but state by state they started adopting seatbelt laws, meaning if a cop saw you driving without your seatbelt, they could pull you over and you get a ticket for that. Click it or ticket. They had some cute little thing that made you feel good about getting the fine. And so you say, well, at least it rhymed, right? So, okay, so again, the typical dispute was in terms of liberal, conservative, nanny government kind of thing versus public safety. The way the typical argument played out was, hey, this is public safety, and this is crazy. Who in his right mind wants to drive around without wearing a seatbelt? That's going to drive up healthcare costs, and the taxpayers are probably going to end up eating some of that, and it's going to break up the family. Some breadwinner, gets in a car accident. This is crazy. This is a very sensible regulation. Only nut job libertarians could possibly object. And then, of course, the opponents of this largely just made the argument of, hey, if I want to be stupid, then I should have the right to do that. The government, what next? They're going to tell me, that I can't have candy bars and so on, right? And Mayor Bloomberg pretty much lived up to those fears. So that was the way the arguments played out. Some economists came into the scene, notably Sam Peltzman, the University of Chicago, and he pointed out something that was much more subtle. And again, it's the same pattern as the first thing. He was pointing out it's not obvious, actually, that these seatbelt laws will even make things safer, right? So let's not just stipulate that and then just make it an issue of, hey, I should have the right to, cause more public harm if I want to, because that's my right. And so specifically, let me first just give you the logic. So the idea is, when you're driving, you do not always have the same level of caution. Okay, and so, for example, when are you more likely to fiddle with the radio or your iPod? Or I used to say changing your CDs, but then I realized at some point the people in the crowd said, "What the heck is a CD?" I don't know. There's these discs and they had music on them and they would spin around. When are you more likely to do that, right? If you're driving on the interstate and it's pouring rain and you're in between two 18-wheelers. Is that you're going to say, I don't like this song, you're going to mess with it? No, you're like this looking, right? Whereas if it's totally sunny, it's wide open, you're driving in the, Nevada or something on the open highway, then, you could basically watch a movie, next to if you had your laptop on your thing, and it would be fine. Okay, so the point is depending on the situation, you drive differently. Another way I motivate it is to say, when I was driving home from the hospital and I had my newborn son in the car, that was the safest I have ever driven. I was doing like hand signals and stuff, signaling, looking 10 different ways. It was like I had nitroglycerin in the trunk. That's how I was driving. It's not that now that he's older and I'm driving around, I'm trying to get him killed. But the point is just you don't exercise the same degree of caution. And so, it's when people do get in car accidents, it's not like they woke up that morning and said, I think I'm going to drive recklessly today. That's not what it is. But the point is people have different degrees of caution. So the argument goes, and what Peltzman was looking at, investigating, is he was saying, people drive with a certain degree of caution and so forth, and if the government comes in now and imposes this artificial penalty if you're caught not wearing a seatbelt, well, how is that supposed to change anything? Why would somebody think that would be a good idea and would improve public safety? Because the theory must be there's people who are now going to wear a seatbelt who otherwise wouldn't have because of the fear of getting that financial penalty. And so Peltzman was saying, okay, so that kind of a person, if before they were fine driving around without a seatbelt, and they thought that was a good trade-off in terms of their comfort or whatever and the chance of getting in an accident, and if I get into an accident, do I want a seatbelt on or not? If they were the kind of person that made that decision and that trade-off and thought, nah, I don't need to have a seatbelt, I'm just going down the street, to pick up something from the store, I don't need to wear a seatbelt for that. If that's the kind of person we're talking about, and it must be, since those are the people whose behavior we want to influence with this fine, then now that they have a seatbelt on, they're going to feel a little bit safer, right? And so they may drive a little bit more recklessly on the margin than they did before. Now, it doesn't mean every single person whose behavior changes is now going to go get an offender bender, but the point was, if you're talking about thousands of people driving day in and day out, in a given state that has this new change in the policy, over the course of a year, you may observe more accidents, right? Because now there's that many more people driving a little bit more recklessly. And so, that you get the theory, and the question is just, well, come on, is that really a big factor or not? So he ran a bunch of analysis. Now, it's, when you run these regressions and stuff, a lot of times it's, the results are not bulletproof, but he did tend to find that, and the way it was pretty good in terms of just the statistical experiment or analysis, is you could have adjacent states, one of which would pass a new seatbelt rule and the other one which didn't. And so you could kind of look at them and see what are their accident patterns like historically, and then check and see the year after the one state passes it and the other one kept the old rules, and then see is there a divergence. So that was kind of the way they could have somewhat of a controlled experiment. And so he found that the number of accidents went up, motor vehicle accidents went up, but the number of, the number of fatalities went down, I think, of drivers, okay, in the states that had the change. And so that kind of makes sense, all right, that there was more accidents, but given that you're going to be in an accident, you want to have your seatbelt on, and so more people now are wearing seatbelts. Okay, that kind of makes sense. But what he also found was that the death rate among pedestrians changed. So why would the death rate among pedestrians change in states that passed this legislation? If you think about it, drivers are a little bit more reckless now because some of them feel safer because now they're wearing seatbelts when before they chose not to. And so if they're driving just a little bit more recklessly, the light's yellow and it's going to change to red, and if you go ahead and go through it, or you're driving a little more quickly, because of that and because they get into more accidents, that also means they hit more pedestrians or people on bikes or whatever. And so even though the people in cars are better off given they're going to be in an accident because now more of them are wearing seatbelts, that doesn't do anything for the people on foot or riding bicycles. Okay, so the lesson from this, the reason I'm bringing this one up is, again, just another example of unintended consequences. I'm trying to give you sort of fun little examples of areas where government policy is not having the effect, or at least it may have like a main effect, but then it has these other things going on that most people would not have thought of, and these are areas where economists specialize in. They think through the logic and say, wait a minute, if you tinker with incentives, let's look at what actually happens, not just what the title on the legislation is or what the intent was of the legislation. Let's look at the actual outcome. So again, for here, the point was it's not merely a trade-off between your personal liberties versus public safety. It changes, the composition of public safety. And it's not obvious that perhaps slightly reducing motor fatalities among people who otherwise would have, in a sense, killed themselves is better if it then hurts people, because the pedestrians and the people, the people on the bikes or whatever, they had nothing. Now they're more at risk from something that they can't very easily protect themselves. Okay, another example in this genre that I like to talk about is so-called three strikes laws. So here, again, this might be a little bit before your time, but this was a big deal when I was like junior high, high school. And so what it is, three strikes legislation or laws, it's saying things, they have the specifics differ from state to state, but the idea is, like the voters would often in a state, there'd be a referendum on this kind of thing, and so they would say, hey, if somebody is convicted of a third felony, so that's like the 3 strikes, the metaphor for foreigners is coming from the American, baseball, but the idea was, and so they'd say three strikes and you're out, right? Because that's what it is in baseball. If you get 3 strikes, you're out and you have to go sit down. And so here they were saying, if you get convicted of a third felony, which to most people sounds like a serious crime, something's classified as a felony rather than as a misdemeanor, you'd think, oh, that must be something really bad. So they're saying if somebody gets convicted of a third crime, then they get a mandatory minimum, it depends state to state, like life in prison or something, or it might be like 25 years or something. Because what they wanted to do, there was a definite reason that this stuff proliferated, is because there were all these like outrageous examples, and some of them were in California, as you can imagine, where these liberal judges were just doing a slap on the wrist for hardened criminals and letting them back out in the streets because prisons were overcrowded, and then they would go and commit some horrible crime, right? So there was a lot of this anecdotal examples of somebody who had been arrested previously for armed robbery or something, and then only spent 6 months in jail and then goes out and kills somebody, okay? And so the push for this kind of legislation was to say we want to take the discretion away from the judges and not let them, let these people out. Come on, if it's your third conviction for a felony, give me a break. You're, a bad apple, and you should be locked up for a long time, maybe for life, depending on the specifics of the legislation. So that's what this is. And then again, you can imagine the standard left-right way the arguments played out. Pro-law and order conservatives were really in favor of this, whereas, people who were concerned about the criminal's background and saying, well, we need to understand the root causes of crime, and they come from a broken family, and maybe we need more spending, and why don't we put more money into schools instead of prisons? That you can imagine the way the argument played out in the standard left-right paradigm in U.S. politics. But some economists looked at it again, trying to look at the unintended consequences, and they said, well, hang on. So think about that. So suppose the actual policy change is to say that if you're convicted of a third felony, you get life in prison without the possibility of parole, period. Like the judge has no discretion, regardless of the circumstances of your case. Third felony conviction, you go to jail for life. They're saying, so think about the incentives there. Suppose you're somebody who already has 2 felony convictions. And by the way, there are things that are felonies that are, like somebody who gets caught bringing smoke bombs into high school and gets caught. In some states, that could be a felony that's on your record. All right? I'm not saying I'm pro smoke bombs, but the point is, a lot of people would think that's just a harmless prank. Part of the problem with this is that when people normally hear felony, they're thinking it's something like holding up a 7-Eleven at gunpoint, which presumably is a felony. But there's things that are felonies that would not strike most people as the actions of a hardened criminal, more of like a stupid prank or kid was hanging around the wrong crowd. But in any event, suppose there's somebody who's walking around with has 2 felony convictions under his belt, and he's in the midst of committing a crime that he knows if he gets caught, it would be a third felony, right? So like you're robbing a convenience store, like maybe you have a drug habit or something, you need money, and you're holding up a convenience store with a weapon, and if I get arrested for this, my life is over. I'm in prison forever if I get arrested and convicted. So they're saying perversely, in that kind of situation, the smart thing to do would be to make sure there's no witnesses. All right, and so your normal human inclination might be just to get the money and leave, but actually if you're going to think rationally through it and you realize on the margin, and especially if it's a state with no death penalty, and say, okay, if they catch me, what are they going to do? They're going to put me in prison. If I don't do anything, I just rob them and leave, and they catch me and I get caught, I'm going to prison for life. What if I shoot everybody and kill all the witnesses, and then they catch me? What's going to happen? I'm going to go to prison for life. So either way, the punishment to me is the same. If a bunch of people saw me and I leave, I might get caught. I'm more likely to get caught. And so why wouldn't I just kill all the witnesses? Okay, so I'm doing an exaggerated example to show the logic of it. But you can see in general, the point is it's not clear that you're actually keeping the public safe from these hardened criminals by having what is kind of an arbitrary thing. I mean, suppose baseball's rules were 4 strikes and you're out. Then will we go ahead and change all the prison sentencing? You know what I'm saying? That's kind of weird that they're doing prison sentencing based on the rules from baseball. So, besides, and so again, you see the logic of that, how it's kind of like a crazy, like, oh, come on, that's some goofy economist come up with some weird thought experiment. But they went and looked, did the regression analysis, and there was, I saw a study that was done in California with some jurisdictions where they, I've looked at the study, they think they did a pretty good job trying to control for possible extraneous factors, and it did look like what they were looking at was police trying to apprehend a suspect, and were the police officers more likely to be injured or killed based on how many previous felony convictions the suspect had. Now, you might say, well, wait a minute, somebody with more felony convictions probably is a more dangerous person, other things equal. And so I think they tried to control, for that, like they were saying before and after this policy change, right? I know I just said a lot. Let me try to say that carefully. So the idea was, before this policy change, they looked and said, the police trying to apprehend somebody with 2 felony convictions under his belt, how likely is it that the police are going to be injured or killed in that capture attempt or arrest attempt? And then after this policy change, and it seemed like, a statistically significant result that after this policy change, if the police are trying to get somebody who's got 2 previous felony convictions, it's more likely that person is going to injure or kill at least one officer when they're trying to arrest the person. Okay, so if you, again, make sure you're not losing, the logic. Why would that be? That kind of makes sense. If the person only cares about trying not to go to prison for life, that, beforehand, in other words, they would get in more trouble, right? Before this arbitrary rule, they would know, oh shoot, there's police chasing me. I'm going to go to jail for a long time because I just, held up my 3rd convenience store. But you wouldn't take your gun out and start shooting at the cops as they're approaching your car because I'm going to get in even more trouble, especially if I kill a cop, right? Whereas with this rule in place, if it's a state that doesn't have a death penalty, they're already going to do the worst thing they could possibly do to you. And so maybe it makes sense to try to fight to the death and to evade capture. Okay, so again, I'm not here taking a stand on any of these 3 things in terms of what's the right policy. I'm just trying to get you to think like an economist and realize there's unintended consequences of engaging in certain regulations. Okay, so now the fun examples are over. We're going to learn about supply and demand. You have an XY axis. On this axis, there's price. So in the U.S. it would be in dollar terms. So dollars are, it's like $10, $20. Okay, so price is going up this way. I'm making up the specific numbers, but the idea is price is going up this way. And then this axis is quantity. So the quantity of the good or service that we're talking about. So, 100 units, 200 units, 300 units, what have you. Okay, and then you're going to have 2 curves, the supply and the demand curve. So the supply curve, just abbreviated by an S. The important thing is it slopes upward. That's what's called the law of supply. And so what that means is the price. So what is this line? What is it graphing? What is the curve representing? It's just the intersection of all these points that line up with a particular price and a particular quantity. All right, so here this looks 10, 20, 30, this looks like about maybe $38, just eyeballing it. And this looks like it's about, what, 260? So the idea is on this particular supply curve, if the price is $38, the suppliers want to sell 260 units of whatever this thing is, if it's, bottles of soda or something, okay? And then the demand curve slopes downward, so D for demand. And so that's what the law of demand says, is that other things equal as the price goes down, the quantity demanded goes up. The law of supply, again, was upward sloping, meaning as the price goes up, producers want to bring more to market. Okay, so that's the basic, and for most analyses, that's all you really need to know. Like all that's really important that's going to drive the analysis is that supply slopes up and demand slopes down. Okay, in practice, there's no reason to suppose these things are actually straight lines. They could be curvy, they could be disjointed things, but you'll see that for the uses to which we put this, it's really just important that supply goes up and demand goes down typically, and perhaps the slope might affect the argument. And then in a normal market where the government doesn't intervene, what do we do with this? Well, you can imagine it's where they intersect, something special happens there. That's what the market clearing price is. So here that looks like it's about $39. And maybe it's, 265 units, something like that. Okay, and so the idea is, graphically where they intersect, what does that mean? That just is saying that's the price that is hitting both the supply and demand curves at the same thing. And so what does it mean economically? The market clearing price, or what we call the equilibrium price, is such that the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied. And then let me just say two more things on this and we'll get back to the PowerPoint. Why is it the equilibrium price? Why would we think eventually, if this were the supply and demand curves, that it would settle down, that the actual price would be in that vicinity and the actual quantity would be around there? Because if it were a lot higher, what if the price for some reason were $45? Well, at that price, again, how does this work? You'd say, well, the quantity demanded is what? You take the price over, so you hit this demand thing, and you drop it down, and it's way down here. It's like about 140, just eyeballing it. But at 45, the supply, again, you start the stipulated price, and you just go over until you get to the curve, and you come down, dun, 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 and that's up here, I don't know, it looks like about 380, something like that. Okay, so the idea is at $45, that's not an equilibrium price, because at this high price that's well above what we said the equilibrium was, the quantity supplied is a lot bigger than the quantity demanded. So this is what's called a surplus. Sellers are trying to sell a lot more units than buyers want to buy when the price is that high. Okay? And so that can't be an equilibrium. The sellers are showing up to market and no one's buying it, so what would they do? They would lower price to try to move that inventory. And so the price would come down. This is too high, that's unsustainable. Similarly, if for some reason the price were down here at 25, the opposite would happen. At this price, the demand is way out here at this quantity, but the quantity supplied, where does this price hit the supply curve? It hits it over here, and it's way down here. So this discrepancy, this gap, is a shortage. So a shortage means the quantity demanded is bigger than the quantity supplied, right? So this price is too low, people are trying to buy more, and suppliers aren't bringing enough units to market, and so demanders bid up the price, and so it gets there. Okay, so that's the logic of how it works, and so you'll see in a minute what would happen if the government comes in and interferes with that mechanism. Okay, but that's the logic of supply and demand, and why, left to its own devices, you would think a market would eventually bounce around perhaps, but would hit the equilibrium price where quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. Price controls, there's two main varieties of this. A price ceiling sets the legal maximum, so that means in practice that if the government sees a seller trying to charge more than the legally stipulated maximum ceiling price, you get in trouble. And so that leads to shortages. And so examples of that would be rent control, consumer products in Venezuela right now. You guys have probably heard how there's shortages in Venezuela. Well, that's because a two-pronged double whammy. Their central bank, their monetary authority, pumped in too much money, and so prices were rising. The government didn't like that. People were upset about rising prices, so the government put in place price controls, and then products disappeared from the shelves. And another example would be the USA in the 1970s. Okay, so you may remember, or not remember, you may have heard of the fact that there were wage and price controls. In particular, there were gas lines in the 1970s where people would literally be lined up out to the street. Cars would be lined up trying to get gasoline from service stations. And the public a lot of times thinks, oh yeah, that was because the OPEC nations embargoed us or something. And yes and no. The OPEC embargo could raise the price of oil and then hence gasoline, but by itself, external powers can't cause shortages in your country. What causes shortages is if your government imposes price controls. So I don't think anyone later this week is doing rent control. I'm just showing you the logic of what happens with rent control. The idea is we have something like the market for apartments in a certain area. So here's the price and here's the quantity. And so maybe it's like $100 a month, $200, $300, $400, $500. All right, so it's not like it's Manhattan or something. And then, 1,000 units, 2,000 units, 3,000. Okay, so make sure I do this right. Suppose this is the actual supply and demand of the way the market works. It intersects at 3,000 units, and let's just say it's 350. Okay, so the idea is this very cheap city, which is the way I picked the numbers, you can get an apartment for $350 a month. All right, and at that level, that's exactly where supply and demand meet. So at $350 a month, owners of buildings and rental units want to rent out 3,000 apartment units, and potential tenants, renters, looking at the demand curve at $350 a month, want to also rent 3,000 units. So it matches. Everybody's happy. The government comes in and says $350 a month, that's outrageous. Who can afford to live there? Again, must be a very poor city. I should have picked the numbers differently. And they say, you know what, that's unconscionable. Only the most anybody's allowed to charge is $200 a month. Okay? So what would happen? If we catch any landlord charging above $200 a month, you're going to get in big trouble. So that would be an example of rent control. It's a price ceiling. So what happens, assuming the government enforces this and people obey it and they don't just ignore it and don't get caught, what ends up happening? Well, at that level, again, you have this big discrepancy. This gap right here, there's a shortage. All right, so at this low level, now that apartments are cheaper, not just 3,000 people, but way over here, so maybe 4,300 people are now looking for an apartment because now it's cheaper, right? If at $350 a month, only 3,000 people wanted to rent their own unit, now at 200, more people are going to come onto the market and say, oh, actually, I'm going to move out. I don't want to live with my parents, or people who before had been doubled up at 350, now at 200, more of them might say, I'm just going to get my own place, okay? So more people are trying to rent apartments, namely 1,300 more with these numbers that I picked, right? Originally it was 3,000, now it's 4,300. But at the same time, landlords don't want to rent out as many units, right? It's shrunk, looks like about, 1,600, something like that. Okay, so instead of 3,000 units now being available for rent on the marketplace, only 1,600 units are available. Now, just to not confuse you, you might say, well, what does that mean? Does the units actually just disappeared? It's like they torpedoed their building? No, but there's all kinds of ways, like the owner of a building might not rent it out to outsiders. They might just keep it for storage or something, or they might keep it empty, vacant, in case they have out-of-town guests coming and say, oh yeah, I've got this, a spare, especially if you think of it in terms like Airbnb, that clearly the price that you can get is going to affect how many units are available on the market. Okay, so the point is, at this lower level, now there's this shortage. So the government's intention was to make apartments more affordable, to make living more affordable, housing more affordable. And for the people who are lucky enough to still be in these 1,600 units that are still on the market, sure, they might be glad they're paying $200 a month rather than $350. But clearly the people who are hurt are the ones now who can't get an apartment at all. So it's not clear that you're helping them by making housing more affordable if now they can't get housing, period. And so this is, if you've ever lived in a city with rent control, it's like when I went to NYU, Manhattan had lots of pockets of pretty stringent rent control. And it was really a hassle to move apartments, right? You had to know somebody. It wasn't just that you would go and get on the internet and find a place and go pay the money. It was really a task, and that was partly why. I had a friend who got into a rent-controlled building, and it was weird because there was a guy who had been living there before, and then that guy wanted to move out because he was getting married, and this place was a total bachelor pad. A woman would never want to set foot in this place. It was not safe for human occupancy in terms of the bacteria, but it was in a great neighborhood, and for the price that they were legally allowed to charge, it was fantastic, right? And so my friend was living there, but the guy who had previously been there, he had to still on paper be the occupant, right? Because the way the laws worked, he didn't own it. So he was just, but if he had moved out, then the landlord was allowed to raise the rent for the new tenant. And so once you got your foothold in a place like that, you all of a sudden had this great economic good that you could give to your buddies or your relatives or whatever. Okay, so again, so you're not getting lost. The one guy was in there. It was a great location for Manhattan for the price it was being charged because the landlord was not allowed to charge more because that guy had been there already. But if that guy moved out and my friend tried to move in, the landlord would have been allowed to jack up the rent a lot. This is the way the regulations worked. And so the one guy moved out and then had my friend come in, and my friend would just pay him the rent, but they couldn't, like the other guy's mail had to still come there because he was worried if he did a change of address, a forwarding of address, the mailman would know he moved out and tell the landlord. And so there's all kinds of, the weirds, like a Seinfeld episode or something where my friend had to get the guy's mail and give it to him periodically and stuff like that. So it was just a big hassle, but again, you can see how the government was creating these pockets of economic goods. The other problem with this is it leads rise to this, what's called a slumlord. Okay, so you may have heard that term. And the idea is there were whole, areas, buildings where the superintendent or the landlord, the owner was a scoundrel, right? And was not very concerned about customer service. The water heater would go out and then people would wake up and the water would be freezing. They'd call the landlord and he wouldn't care. And so you say, why is that? Is it just greedy capitalist pigs who don't care about customer service? No, well, the answer is it's because of the rent control. That because of this phenomenon, the owner of the building's not getting the money that he was before, and he's got a long line of people who, if he evicts a tenant, are happy to come in. So if somebody's just, a few days late with the rent and has a bunch of little kids, the landlord has no incentive to be nice and say, okay, just, pay me when you can and I'll let it slide for a month or two. No, just kick them out and bring in somebody else who's going to pay right away. All right? Whereas in a market, you would do things like put on fresh coats of paint, put on the, security lights to make sure your tenants feel safe, all sorts of extra little things to make your product stand out from others because you're competing on several margins. But when the government comes in and arbitrarily says you can't charge what the normal market price should have been, now you have, again, a long line of people who are happy to come in, and they're okay if the water heater goes out because, wow, what a deal. So the point is, it's not merely the people who are losing out on the ability to get in, but it's also even the people who are now in there and thinking, oh, I'm saving $150 a month. That's not a pure gain, right? They may say, yes, I like the new situation, but the point is there's other ways the landlords reduce the quality of the goods so that it's not a pure gain. Okay, let me speed up here. A price floor is sort of the opposite symmetrically. It sets a legal minimum where the buyers get punished if they pay less. And that leads to surpluses. So the classic example here would be a minimum wage law. So the buyer of labor, the employer, is not allowed to pay less than what the minimum wage is. And so that leads to surpluses, meaning there's workers who are trying to find a job, who are trying to sell labor, and they can't find a buyer. Okay, one point of clarification. Price controls in this context don't include things like you may have heard of price floors or supports for agricultural products, or the Fed, fixing interest rates. Those sorts of things are not what economists typically mean by price controls. And the reason is because the way they implement that stuff. So if the government says we want wheat farmers to be guaranteed a certain price, it's not that the government comes in and says if we catch anybody paying less than this price to wheat farmers, we're going to put you in jail. Rather, the government says, we will directly send you money. Like if the market price is such and such and we want to give you a little bit more, we'll send you a check for the difference out of tax funds. Or we'll come in and buy the wheat and store it in a silo. And that's the way we'll keep the price at a certain level. All right, so that's not a price control that has the dynamics of what I just went through. Okay, so family leave legislation. Do you guys know what that is? Does that mean anything to you? Okay, so some of you are shaking your head. It depends on the specifics, but there's a push right now in the United States to do this, and the way it's motivated is to say, oh my gosh, all the other civilized Western nations have much more generous family leave policies, and we're backward here in the United States. What this is, it's things saying, and again the details differ, but it's saying there should be regulations such that if somebody has a particular qualifying event, like a baby comes, or there's maybe a family member, a close family member who gets cancer and you have to take care of them, but if there's some thing that arises in the home so that a worker needs to take time off to go deal with that family situation, then you shouldn't lose your job for sure. Like, your job should be guaranteed waiting for you when you come back after you deal with that situation. But some are even more aggressive, saying it should be paid, up to a certain amount, like a percentage of your normal salary. And so why don't we have that? Because there's similar laws like that in other European countries. So regardless of, with the interference with property rights from a libertarian purist standpoint, there's unintended consequences. In particular, it would make, other things equal, this kind of legislation would make employers more hesitant to hire a young woman who's married and might have kids down the road, as opposed to a man or opposed to a woman who's unmarried, and so forth, or for other reasons if you thought, yeah, this woman's not going to have children. All right, because if you just think about it, you're the employer, regardless of the intentions and whether you think it's a good thing socially or not. If all of a sudden you have an employee who has a baby and then now doesn't come to work for 6 months, and especially if you have to keep paying that person who's not showing up, I mean, that's a business cost, right? Then you have to bring in somebody else, train them a little bit, and then especially if you have to give the job back to the other person, that really interferes with the flow of your business. Other things equal, you would rather not have to do that. You'd rather have somebody who's going to just keep coming to work and you keep paying them for showing up and working. And so it's not obvious that you're helping women by building that in there. Employers would take that into consideration to the extent that they could, given anti-discrimination laws. Or it might be that, okay, yeah, if you hire a woman that's younger and is statistically more likely to have a baby than some other worker is, you may pay that person less, knowing there's a chance they're going to exercise this option down the road. So in terms of the whole lifetime of them working for this company, the way we're going to handle that is to pay them less for when they're here on the books working compared to somebody else. Okay, so the idea is if people are trying to push for parity in pay between men and women and stuff like that, you don't want to have something here that this is artificial boon to women that means employers got to pay them more, statistically speaking. So men are eligible to take family leave, but just statistically in practice, women would be more likely to exercise that option. Okay, another one. This just ran on the website marginalrevolution.com 2 days ago, I think. If you're curious and want to read more, Alex Tabarrok summarized it. This was a pretty clever paper that these economists just recently published. It just came out. So the issue is it's what's called ban the box. And so some employers, when they have the initial application process and applicants for a job opening, fill in their stuff and attach their resume or whatever and mail it in, some of the applications have this box saying, have you ever been convicted of a felony, yes or no? And so some states have legislation to prohibit that, to say you're not allowed to ask that. That's unfair, that discriminates against people with criminal history, and they should be able to move on and just look at their job performance or their past resume, stuff like that. Okay, so the theory was, or what they were investigating, these economists, was to say, is this going to have a disparate impact on racial minorities? Because statistically speaking, you're more likely, a black job applicant is more likely in the United States to have been convicted of a felony than a white applicant, again, just statistically speaking. And so if you're an employer and you really don't want convicted felons working for you, and that's what you originally were going to try to screen out, and now the government's saying you can't ask that, what can you do instead? Well, you might also, you can't just ask their race perhaps. And so what they measured in this paper that Alex Tabarrok summarized was they looked at, they sent a bunch of fake applications in, the people who wrote this paper, and they were measuring the responses. And so for some of them, they gave what are typical black names, and then other ones that were more neutral. And so they were giving names that, so the idea was an employer might look at that and infer this person is black, even though technically the application didn't say that. It wasn't like a racial thing checked. And so then they were checking to see if the government passes this regulation, is there going to be more of a penalty against people who have names that are traditionally black names versus ones that are more race-neutral names. And they found statistically significant result that yes, if the government says you as an employer are not allowed to use this question on your application form, and looking at firms that used to have it and then took it off because of the regulation, those firms were less likely to call for a further phone interview applicants whose names were traditionally black names than before the policy change. Okay, and so the interpretation the Economist gave was to say there are some employers out there who it's important to them to not hire convicted felons, and so they asked that. The government is now taking that option away, so what are they going to do? They're not just going to suck it up and say, okay, they're going to respond by saying, all right, we can't directly ask that, so we will look at the names, and if it looks like it's someone is black who's applying, we're less likely to call that person back because statistically speaking, that person's more likely to have been a convicted felon than a white applicant. So the point was, it's not obvious that so yeah, you may be helping convicted felons, get a new chapter in their life, but this policy contributes to bias against black applicants, and in particular, black applicants who do not have a felony conviction. The point was before, if they're allowed to check no, then those kinds of employers are more likely to call them back, whereas now those applicants cannot as so easily stand out and distinguish themselves and say, hey, I have a clean record. So what are they doing here? The legislation, among other things, the whole raison d'etre of this is to say we want to guarantee even people with serious medical conditions can get health insurance. So somebody who has brain cancer comes up to a health insurance company, says, give me a policy, I want insurance. They cannot now legally deny that person, and they can't charge a huge figure either. They can't just say, okay, yeah, we'll give you health insurance, but we're going to charge you $100,000 a year in premiums. That would be a farce, right? That would be equivalent to not giving them insurance. And so what are some of the perverse consequences? Well, one thing that has been happening is the health insurance, think of it, you're a health insurance company, someone's coming up, that person's going to cost you tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars in expenses that you got to reimburse if it's somebody who has a serious cancer condition, and you legally cannot, get them to not be your client anymore. They're your customer. You have to accept them. So what do you do? Well, one thing you might do is you ask your experts, say, look in our region, who are the best cancer doctors? And they find that out, and they go, okay, make sure they are not in network. Make sure they're out of network for the plans we offer. And so why would they do that? Because then they would say they want people who have cancer, when they're shopping around, looking at our company to say, oh no, we don't like that company because the best doctors, for my condition are not in network with them. Let's look at somewhere else. Okay, so the point is, and there's a lot of horror stories of people who are getting health insurance. They were so happy that this new legislation came in, and then they get in there, and not only are they paying premiums higher than they expected, but they're still paying a lot of out-of-pocket expenses and saying, what how is this possible? I still can't afford this. And so it's not clear that it's actually helping the people that it was intended to, or it's certainly not helping them as much as people originally thought because of these unintended consequences.